I really appreciate the lovely introduction, but I also should say on a personal level that my folks came from Jamaica to Canada in the 50s, so they were really early immigrants. I was born in the 60s, but they came in the 50s. And my dad's brother also came a little later, maybe 61, to Hamilton. So I grew up with an uncle that lived on Upper James, and I used to visit here all the time. I have an enduring memory of being a little kid in the 70s, just being taken to see the 70s soul singer Lou Rawls, you know, here in town at the concert hall, and lots of great memories of Art Gallery of Hamilton and coming around McMaster's. It sort of became this kind of, well, it's a growing campus, and it's great. I haven't been here in a few years, so it was great to come in today and see all the growth here. It's always been a really innovative place, and I think you all should be super thrilled that you've got Pamela Edmonds running things at the gallery. No, it's really true. She's, you know, just in my mind, I'd almost say a beacon of hope in the art world in Canada, because she brings a lot of knowledge and expertise in many areas, but a real focus and passion for contemporary African and diasporic art. And we've worked together over many years. Pam's written for shows that we've done more than 10 years ago. I feel like we've been in the trenches together for a long time. So also a thrilling moment to kind of, you know, after having her do so many things with Wedge, return the favor and come and see her beautiful show here, you know, in Hamilton. So thank you, Pam. Yeah. So the Wedge story, I'll kind of roll through some slides and maybe take some questions at the end. If something's burning and you need me to stop, no problem, just shout it out. But I'll give you a little background about my personal story, because the art collection, the Wedge Collection, is a very personal collection. There are many ways to collect artists, you know, and some people do it for investment, some people do it because it's a cool thing to do, some people do it because they inherited something from their family and they kind of roll with it. And for me, collecting really was none of those things. For me, it was like a labor of love and a kind of a way of thinking about my own identity. Remembering that I grew up in a place not unlike Hamilton. I was born and grew up in Windsor, Ontario, a border town, a working class town. If it was the steel industry here, it was the car industry in Windsor, and a very similar kind of place. There were not a lot of black folks around. I think my parents were the second Jamaican family in Windsor. So, you know, my dad was a high school teacher, and I think the first black male high school teacher in the system. So you can imagine what things were like. We're really feeling like an island. And it's very strange because, as you know, across the river is Detroit. Detroit's this vibrant center for African-American culture. It was probably 86% black when I was growing up. So a real strange thing to be this, have this kind of tri-cultural upbringing. You know, Jamaican food and music and culture around the house, seeing my relatives on summer vacations, because my dad was a teacher, going there and having that in my heart and in my soul. But then coming back to Windsor, feeling like an island, and then going across to Detroit. And, you know, for my era, it was Motown music to 70s soul to Detroit techno and, you know, inner city and all that music to, like, you know, by the time I left, it was hip hop and Eminem, and, you know, so it's kind of a very interesting, I look at my life through the lens of music a lot, and how, you know, I kind of had these enriching experiences growing up in this border town with this great radio station, CKLW, and kind of playing music that really spoke to me, and black power movements and blaxploitation films. So as much as it was this working class auto town, there was this great cultural richness all around, and certainly within my own home, parents who really appreciated art and took us a lot to the Detroit Institute of Arts and the Art Gallery of Windsor. So that was a great experience for me. When I was a 10-year-old, I saw that photograph at the DIA in Detroit, and it really burned in my brain. This is a very iconic image from James Van Der Zee, black American photographer, had a photo studio in Harlem in a pretty wonderful era called the Harlem Renaissance. And, you know, I just had grown up, you can imagine, again, watching a lot of American television. So I was seeing African Americans depicted, you know, as buffoons in shows like, Good Times with Sanford and Son, and like I just had never seen images of Black Americans like with this kind of impossible sophistication, the fur coats, the white wall tires, the Cadillac, the beautiful brownstone, and it was like, people showing off their Sunday best and their beautiful new car. It was just like aspirational thing for me, but also this kind of like, wow, there's another world out there. So early on, I had this engagement with art, not really thinking of it that way, but just going like, wow, there's another way to live, and there are many other aspects to my own community that I'm not seeing in media. So like, even as a 10-year-old, I kind of understood that, like, this is kind of where I want to be, but this isn't what I'm seeing even in the rest of the museum, So it was a kind of I wouldn't say it's a call to action for a 10-year-old. It was more like a, geez, there's got to be more stuff out there to see, and it took me on a personal journey about art. So many years later, so that was a 10-year-old. This would be, by the time I'm a 25 or 30-year-old maybe, I'm now in Toronto, got into dental school, got the Jamaican immigrant parents, you should be a doctor. It's just the way it goes. Although I'm very much an arts person, and I think my parents knew that. They wanted that sort of, in their mind, guarantee of success, so professional school. So I ended up being a dentist that collects art. So yeah, not an artist, not a curator, but I think that's, and I love them for that, but it is an interesting journey. When I was in Toronto at school, I used to go to art openings at U of T and at OCAD, it was OCA then, and I just very spontaneously decided to open a gallery in my home. It was this wedge-shaped space in plan, about 4 feet all the way to about 15 feet, and it's big, tall, 17-foot ceilings. And the designer of the space, Del Terlong, is also Jamaican Canadian, and we had our first show with Michael Chambers, who Pamela's worked with, who's a notable African Canadian artist. So that was a really thrilling moment, and I started having these Sunday afternoon salons. This is 1997, so over 20 years ago now. And it was an old factory, one of the first loft conversions in Toronto, down around Richmond and Queen, Richmond and Bathurst. So kind of an interesting idea, this gallery in the home. I was a single guy then. I'm married with a couple kids now, but that was an easier thing to do at that time. And I think the idea of it, this do-it-yourself thing and showing work that I had seen in other places, and I started to travel and go to galleries, it was kind of, again, a very organic thing. I didn't really plan for this. And I did it kind of for myself, like the design of the space with this gallery, but quickly realized that doing these salons and these shows on a Sunday afternoon, people really responded to it. And I think there was a certain level of intimacy involved with seeing, art in someone's home, And I think that led to more opportunities. By the way, that's Karen Carter, who now runs Band. That's a young Karen Carter in that picture. So, it was really art in a house. There's a fireplace, very contemporary space, as you can see, the design. Beautiful space. And we started having shows in that space. Shows that were bringing aspects of Black culture from around the world to Toronto in the form of these photographic shows, usually around the Contact Photo Festival in May every year. So this show is Seydou Keita, it's a kind of a photo master from West Africa, from Mali, was a pretty much a landmark show for us, one that kind of set a tone of bringing work that has never been seen in Canada before. There's a little gallery in Toronto. It was kind of a commercial gallery then. We were actually selling work. Luckily, I kept always 1 or 2 from each show for myself, would buy them for myself. And that kind of started me on this organic process of collecting. Like, these are works that I saw. In this case, I was at a dental convention in Paris and went to Fondation Cartier. The big, beautiful foundation in Paris had this show in 1998 with this wonderful work that I'd never heard of and seen before from West Africa. And I remember talking to Maya Sutnick, who was the head of photography at the AGO at the time, who I just met, and she was all for this. She was like, oh, you should bring it to Toronto. Just do it if you like it. You can go for it. And Stephen Bulger, who many of you know as that beautiful Stephen Bulger Gallery in Toronto, he was another mentor. It's like, yeah, you're a dentist, and you've got this place, you've got a space, like, just go for it. They didn't I didn't have any formal education in art, but I had a lot of passion. I was doing a lot of reading about it. And they were like, just go for it. But they were very supportive. So we'd have these shows, and I'd kind of learn more about the artists. And as it went along, it started to become a collecting exercise, because I would learn about Seydou Keita, and hey, his disciple is Malik Sidibé, an artist sort of 20 years his junior. And I would get on the phone with my not so good French and like literally call the artist in his studio in Bagadaji and Bamako, and like, hey, I want to buy one of your works, and arrange a sort of a price. And there was no dealer then. Now this artist who died recently is represented by Jack Shaman, one of the biggest galleries in the world. So this was a much simpler times in terms of acquiring this art. If you had the eye, passion, and desire, you could actually buy work that you can't get now, even if you could afford it. It's just not for sale. So it's kind of like, I was also very lucky to kind of buy art that spoke to me, that happened to be art that I could have access to at this point in my life. Remembering that I'm a dentist in Toronto, I'm not a big financer, or it was like within my budget to still buy these works. So a very kind of happy accident that the works were affordable then. The whole world has sort of jumped on contemporary African art now, and so that the art market has inflated the prices, and maybe we'll talk about that in the Q&A a bit afterward. It's an interesting aspect of collecting. Just showing some works from the early shows at Wedge, this beautiful kind of a collection of women's hairstyles in Nigeria in the 1970s, work done by Okai Ojakeri. Like, think of that idea of someone having a studio and you get your passport photo done, and then afterward, hey, or just coming up to a woman on the street, like, I want to take a picture of you, but turn around, I want to get the back of your head, Like, it's a wild idea, very conceptual and really interesting. And then you can think of the more is more, like a body of work of like over 1,000 images. Then, it really becomes this reflection of the times. Like, the first skyscraper went up in 1971 in Lagos, and that year women started doing this kind of tower-looking thing with their hair, this conical thing, kind of as a ode to that. And then, so it becomes this marker of time and fashion and politics, and a lot of traditional hairstyles as well. So these kind of series of work really kind of resonated with me as I was thinking about my own Black identity, which was not on a platter, as you now know. Growing up, I wasn't growing up in a Black culture, so I kind of had to learn all these things, tangentially and through research. Like, I wasn't learning in Canadian history class about the Canadian Black, situation, and I certainly wasn't learning about, Africa, and so I had to kind of do this own sort of self-directed project. So it was really a forced self. Did another show with Jurgen Berg's work. He's a German photographer that got to South Africa, escaping just before World War II. He was Jewish, and arrives in what he thinks is going to be a paradise in South Africa, and it's just pre-apartheid, and he sees the segregation ballooning. But he's like a fly on the wall because he's a foreigner, so he can get over and go to a black shebeen, or go to like a white day at the races and like take these pictures. And very interesting show that we did. It also set a template for me that my collection wasn't just going to be Black artists. It was going to be thinking about Black identity and Black culture through contemporary photography, so that it opened it up to being many kind of different ways of telling the story. And I thought that was an interesting thing to mention. So the project really ballooned out with this big show we did in 2003, the first show outside of my home, in a space called SOF, which was owned by Stella Fakiese, who's here, who lives in Hamilton now. And she had a great art space that we decided it was too big for the house, and so we, the move was to a nearby kind of art gallery space, a community space. And this show, which had an image that was on the cover of the Contact Photography Festival, was, the birth of hip hop, really. It's a great series from the 1980s by Jamal Shabazz, who then became a friend. And we had gave him his first art lecture. It was at the AGO at Jackman Hall. And I realized I have an art project, very organically again, like this Wedge Curatorial Projects was born, this, kind of emerging artists, and we're going to give them a platform, get funding to do shows. And so that would be one aspect. And then the Wedge Collection would be over here, this privately owned collection, a public kind of art project. And that kind of, even from then, around 2003, it was beginning to sort of move in that direction. I see it as one thing in my mind, but it's two clear projects, a public one and more of a private one that I think is becoming increasingly public. So the first collection show, I think Camila Singh, who you see in the picture with me on the upper left, was a curator at the time at MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art. She used to be down at Queen and Shaw. And she had this great idea for a show with South Asian artists thinking about hair and fabric and texture called Dyed Roots, and introduced a lot of great artists. Brendan Fernandez, who subsequently was at Art Gallery of Hamilton, and just many great artists came out of that show. And then in the middle of the show, she invited guest curators to have this little room in the middle of her show where we could feature whatever we wanted. I decided to pull some work from my collection, and I called it the Headroom. And it was we made it even into a little barber shop during the first Nuit Blanche. So it was a really interesting idea, using hair as a trope of identity. And then a much bigger show called Becoming started in Detroit and ended up in North Carolina, which had about 110 photographs from my collection. As the collection grew, it started to move into video work. And another kind of small but landmark show called Always Moving Forward at Gallery 44 in Toronto, a nonprofit space. And that's really where Pamela and I started to work together a lot. She had written something for Becoming and then wrote the whole catalog for this show, which was really, I'll show you a few images from the show. It was really work that I had acquired as a collector, going to the biggest sort of Pan-African photography festival. It's every 2 years, called the Bamako Encounters. And it's in Mali. I keep mentioning Mali. It's sort of this birthplace of African photography because it's just a kind of a center of trading near a whole bunch of countries, Senegal, Nigeria, and Ivory Coast, and Ghana. And it's just sort of at the bottom of Mali, this place that many people have gone through. And a lot of people at a train station would just want their picture taken. So there were a bunch of artists that came out of that city, and then they decided to have a big photo festival. And I went to that festival in 2007, and every 2 years, it's a biennial. I went in 2009, 2011. I think the last time I went in 2015, I was asked to be a juror. So I got to be a fixture, and I bought a lot of work that I'd never heard about or seen. And some of those artists are well known now. Samuel Fosso, Mohamed Kamara, Andrew Chabangu, whose work's in the Detroit show right now. Guy Tillum, also in the Detroit show. Mikhail Subotsky, Lolo Vallejo, Calvin Dondo, Ida Malune, who's also lived in Canada at some point. He's from Ethiopia, has become a well-known artist. And Hassan Ajaj, whose work in Morocco is kind of exploring his local arts community. That's a famous dancer in Marrakesh. And he has this series called the Kesh Angels. And it's kind of a riot of colors and kind of consumerism, this fashion fabric with, the Fanta orange cans with Arabic writing, and, but also a political statement about this big multicultural, a big corporation that isn't necessarily doing something for the people. Nestle, it's sort of, this product Nido, and saying to women, you don't need to use breast milk, just use our milk powder. And sort of, he gets his little political statement in there in the middle of all this beauty and sort of riot of colors. So he became a friend, and Hassan has sort of moved on to big projects. But it was a great thing to see all these artists as they were coming out of the box and having their first kind of international show in Bamako. And the work was all very affordable then, and I picked up a lot of work and then showed it in Canada. Mohamed Bourissa, who now is a very big artist, works a lot in fashion. He's thinking about his Algerian background, but growing up in the suburbs of Paris, and all these sort of little vignettes and stories that are made up from real encounters that he had as a kid. And I'm sorry that Lauren Wickware can't be here today. Some of you might know Lauren, who now is in Hamilton. She's a book designer, art books, and we work with her a lot at Wedge. And she designed this great cover for a show that, for me, was the show that was a culmination of all this kind of groundwork. I think I met the director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, who's subsequently become a friend, Thelma Golden, big art world figure, and she told me maybe about 15 years ago, so maybe 5 years or 7 years into my project, she was like, it's great that you're bringing Van der Zee and Seydou Keita and all these artists from around the world to Canada, Ken, but you know, you're bringing the global local. You should start taking the local and making that global. And it really stuck in my mind because I thought, I have great stories to tell about my own family and you know, the story of the Black community in Canada, but I just didn't really think that there was either interest in it or a platform for it. And you know, when she said that, I realized there's a lot of interest whenever I talk about the Black Canadian art scene, and I have a platform with my Wedge project. So it was like, Eureka, I should start doing work, and I started collecting work by African Canadian artists. So we did a show called Position as Desired, which was based on the title of one of the works by Stacey Tyrell, and it was kind of like, I used it as a sort of double entendre, like positioning ourselves as we desire. And it was positioning ourselves in the space of the ROM. So I got this great opportunity to do a show at the Royal Ontario Museum, and it was a little show that you know, the big crystal had just been designed, and they, you know, do you want to do it up here? And I was like, nah, I want to go to that Canadiana gallery that we all went to as kids on bus trips, and you know, they would have like, you know, the Eskimo kind of parka, you know, it's just all these like kind of strange kind of colonial tropes of Canada, like big giant paintings of our European forefathers like Wolfe and Montcalm and all these kind of Canadian heroes. And so I thought we'll do this intervention and put the works in that Canadiana gallery as a, you know, kind of an interruption with these works about African Canadians. And so that was the concept, you know, which was to kind of, you know, put this giant life-size image of this Black subject, you know, insert it in there with Sigmund Samuel and Wolfe and Montcalm. So, and it worked very well. So, and then the show expanded, and I've taken it to Halifax to the Pier 21 Museum of Canadian Immigration. I've taken the show to my hometown of Windsor, and this was its latest larger version as I keep collecting work by African Canadian photographers, and that show was now a year and a half ago in Windsor and very successful. And we've just been asked to do the show in London, England at Canada House, which is Canada's Canadian embassy in London. So that's a big thrill for me. It also shows how the art market and interest, you know, around Black artists is now at the point that a gallery that I petitioned 10 years ago, hey, let's do this in London, really was like, nah, no interest. And now they've come calling, you know, we want to do a show with like Black Canadian artists in London. So all this is very fascinating, and I know Pam's over here nodding her head because everything's become so blackety black, you know. But it's a very funny moment with the art world now. It doesn't validate it anymore for me, although it's a very interesting moment that people are beginning to finally see, you know, the value in, and also the sameness and the difference in all these stories about migration and, you know, stories around race, family, sexuality, you know, just there are familiar tropes already in the art world that people just weren't thinking like, well, you know, Black artists just aren't, you know, really about this. And it's like, once you lift off the cover and you start exploring it, you know, there are the same ideas and more. You're adding something new to the canon, something that maybe only could be told by Black people, you know. And so it's sort of like a very interesting moment happening in the art world where we're beginning to rethink. I think of a show like this show with this Levy Collection and, you know, a very Eurocentric collection, but the way Pamela is rethinking it and activating it in ways like this and programming around a show that starts to kind of think about things through a new gaze, a new lens, and a new way of presenting artwork. And I just came back from a trip to New York and saw the rehanging of the Museum of Modern Art, which was a very inspiring thing. I'm going to encourage all of you, if you can get to New York next year, just go down for a weekend as I did and just see, you know, suddenly there's, you know, works that you'd always seen at a place like that, like Picasso's painting in a room, kind of, you know, talking with a work by Faith Ringgold, the celebrated Black artist who's, you know, elderly now and is sort of, you know, just like enjoying a moment finally where people are recognizing the brilliance of her work and how important it is in the American story. So it's kind of like, and in the story of contemporary art. So it's a very gratifying moment, but also one that has been long coming. I mean, you know, curator like Pam has known about Faith Ringgold's work for probably 20 years and has been celebrating her quilting and all this. So it's really a late, Johnny-come-lately thing with the art world. But I'm happy that the moment is happening while she's alive to enjoy it, you know? So I had to stop and do that, interject and talk about that, because the context of all this is that I wouldn't be showing you this work. Art Gallery Windsor wouldn't be interested if things didn't change in the sort of zeitgeist. There's a feeling now that we want to hear the many and varied stories from all communities, not just, we're talking about race, but varied communities. The stories that people have to tell are important. And this is happening in sports, in music, in art, in politics. And I think that it's a great thing that we're finally coming to a point that, you know, your story's as important as my story is as important as your story, not we get to tell history one way. And I think, you know, my Wedge project is in a larger sense kind of positioning itself in that story, that you want to bring out the many stories about being, in this case, a Black Canadian. So, you know, these works, you know, there's that work that was on the book cover that was at the ROM, you know, is in this show now in the context of artists that came before, like Buseji Bailey and Michael Chambers and others. So, you know, you can't really tell the story, I realize, the contemporary story without going backwards. So there's a lot of vintage images that I have in my collection. You know, just John Hall, for instance, like who's, you know, a runaway slave. It's almost a story like 12 Years a Slave, someone who ran away from slavery in the States, in Kentucky, and got through that little strait. Detroit means the strait, like this thin little Detroit river, and swam across at night with his mom, and, you know, was living in Amherstburg, Ontario, was recaptured, sent back to the States in slavery, escaped again, came back to Canada, and ended up being the town crier. Before you had newspapers, somebody would yell out the news of the day. So he was the town crier in Owen Sound, Ontario. And if you go up to Owen Sound, there's a statue of, you know, John Hall in the main street. You know, he died at 117. I think this photo was when he was 114. And like, I got this image, it was consigned by a family, presumably white family in Canada, that had the little small photograph and gave it to an art dealer, to Stephen Bulger, who then called me and said, I think you might be interested in this image. And so it comes into my collection. So it's an interesting story about how these works, you know, come into a collection, and then what do you do with them? Well, I'm not the guy that wants to lock it away. I want to show people. So we kind of include it in shows and loan a lot of works to other touring exhibitions. Another work from a studio that was in Chatham, Ontario. A place in Toronto. This is the art photo studio, if you know, downtown Toronto, where Trinity Bellwoods Park is. And now there's that Nadej dessert place. Used to be a photo studio. I remember that place. And when they were going out of business, I went by there and got this box of photographs of, you know, for, I don't know, like $300 or something. I got tons of photographs. And so I put some of them together, and thinking about the sameness and difference about the lives of this Black gentleman and white gentleman in Toronto in presumably the 1930s or 40s. It's kind of interesting, you know. Fred Herzog, who died recently, documented many immigrant communities to Vancouver. You know, you look at that and you think, where is that? Is that Hong Kong? Is that Chinatown in San Francisco? It's actually Canada. That's, you know, Pender Street in Vancouver. A Black man who, you know, got there for what way we don't know. He might have been a porter. He might be, you know, in generations before, like Deanna Bowen's generations that got to Vancouver. But we don't think about Vancouver in the 1950s having this, you know, beautiful man, well-dressed with his beautiful daughter, walking their dog, proud citizens in Vancouver at that time. You just don't see a lot of that imagery. It's important to bring it out in the world, you know? And Sten Douglas, who's a very well-known international artist from Vancouver, I bought this image to kind of complement that picture, because he does a lot of made-up stories or narratives based on real events and real stories. And, you know, he had this model dress up as a dancer from a club, the Malabar, that actually existed in Vancouver at the time. And then thrilling to see currently practicing artist in Toronto, Deanna Bowen, that just had a show that actually had real images of real people that were dancers in this club in Vancouver. That may have to be added to the collection because it kind of completes the story. This, you know, this guy on the street who is in this black community that might have gone to that club at that time, you know, fictionalized account of the club, and then a real person who you can name in the black community who is a dancer at that club. It's kind of like interesting how the stories are beginning to piece together, you know. The subject is actually a well-known artist and activist called Complex in Toronto, but the image is by a well-known South African artist named Zanelli Mahoney, part of this great series called Faces and Phases that's thinking about queer culture throughout the world and her own identity, the artist as a lesbian, and thinking about, you know, the many ways that, you know, we are who we are. So, you know, an image of a black artist in Toronto, an image of a soccer player in Johannesburg, it all becomes this big series. So I bought one thinking about Toronto and Complex wearing the shirt from two black guys, an old hip hop label in Toronto. Michael Chambers, wonderful artist who is someone that Pam has championed and written a beautiful catalog about. Stella Fakiese, whose work, who lives in Hamilton now, who's did this very early work, you know, in the 90s about police violence, and kind of crazy that we've come back around again to this moment, particularly in Toronto with police violence. And so, you know, a very, very moving image, very powerful image. David Zapparoli is thinking about his mixed race identity, being Italian and black. Buseji Bailey, who is a real important artist who has been largely forgotten, and lately people are coming around to seeing how important her early work in the 80s and 90s around identity, or identity as a black woman, how important that work is in the canon of Canadian art. An image by a Toronto artist who's a boxer, who, you know, Pete Doherty, who kind of captured this beautiful image of kids having fun, doing what kids do. That's the Positionist Desired image from Stacey Tyrell. Sameness and Difference. More sameness and difference from Megan Morgan. These are all black Canadian artists. So, you know, we have this endless variety of thinking about different ways of being black in Canada. Christina Leslie, whose work, she's also mixed race. Her dad is Jamaican, and she did a really interesting art project, this OCAD student. I bought this work at the Grad X show, which you should all attend, because you can see really interesting work that might speak to you, and it's very affordable. So I've bought a lot of work at grad student shows. I think another person who's in the trenches with us, Pamela, Julie Crooks, is the one who called me excitedly and said, "Have you been to Grad X? You know, you got to see this work." And I was like, "Yeah, I just came back. I really liked it. I'm going to buy a couple." She was like, "You need to buy all 14 of them," and I did. You know, like it was sort of, you know, smart. Sometimes you get kicked in the pants, like, "Get this. This is so much about your collection." So she interviewed her Jamaican relatives and asked about their stories about coming to Canada, and did it in a language that she kind of heard. It was almost like a Jamaican language that's been kind of, in some ways, influenced by her Canadian. So if a Jamaican reads this, it doesn't sound like patois. It's a little bit Canadianized, and it becomes this very interesting hybrid work. But the stories are very funny, and, you know, it's an important work in the collection. Dolly Petros, who's going to have a solo show at the Power Plant in Toronto in late January. So you'll have to go to that. He's a friend. I'm one of his first and biggest collectors. I have a lot of work from Dolly. He was an Eritrean immigrant to Saskatchewan, of all places, and then went to Montreal, and then ended up in Boston. And so, you know, he's now in Chicago, a true kind of international artist, and he keeps thinking about place and memory, and as a big part of his, you know, his personal story, which is a big part of his art practice. But this is kind of a take on, you know, very famous image in the canon of Western art, and the idea is to sort of reclaim the thing with a black subject. And I think that we know that an artist like Kehinde Wiley has been doing this, but Dawit had never heard of Kehinde Wiley when he was at art school in 2003, so this is an independent idea. Erica DeFreitas, who is doing really important work, thinking a lot about language, thinking a lot about her own identity. She's based in Toronto. John Black, who did a love letter to sort of Jamaican Canadians in Little Jamaica, kind of an area that's really dying out around Eglinton West subway station in Toronto. And Anique Jordan, who many of you have heard of, who is an artist and activist in Toronto. And it's a kind of a detail of a great series that she did about a lost community, the early black community in downtown Toronto, around where City Hall is. And Deanna Bowen, her fantastic and very important spoken word, kind of oral history about her family coming from the States through to Canada, right to the moment of her going to art school. Family history over 250 years. Fantastic project called Some of the Parts. You can actually see that on YouTube. You can visit that. And I'll just end the talk with just this kind of move in my mind after many years of photography, realizing that I'm missing out by not acquiring paintings, because there's only one of a kind in the world, and there's something very beautiful about that. Like a lot of collectors without an art background, I started in photography because it was more accessible to me. Photography's in magazines and on TV and on the internet, and it just spoke to me, and it was more affordable. But as I went along, I realized, I'm gonna have to buy some paintings, because sometimes, you can tell the same story and maybe in a different way with different media. So that was a final kind of eureka moment for me. Yeah, I can be beyond just being a photography collector. So in the last 10 years, I've started collecting works by some great artists. Barclay Hendricks, this work's become iconic. It's on tour with a fantastic show called Soul of a Nation, thinking about Black Power movements in the 60s to the 80s in America. Lynette Yadam-Boyachi, who I'm lending this work to her big mid-career retrospective coming up in London and Tate Britain next year. Ghanaian British artist. Jim Adams, not a well-known artist. I think he will be. He's an artist from Philadelphia who left America and came to British Columbia in his 20s. Started flying. That's a self-portrait. I bought this work last year at Art Toronto. Big, beautiful painting. And I just think, it's also super Canadian in my mind, in that kind of genre of Canadian landscape painting, like Pratt and others. It's this sort of flat landscape thing. And to think that there was, black artists that did this work in 1975 in Canada. He's got a lot of great paintings, so look up Jim Adams. You can find him on Instagram. He's now in his 80s. Chris O'Philly, well-known artist. It's work that we've lent to international shows. Henry Taylor, another African-American artist who's found success. I think I bought this for $750 at Art Basel Miami about 12 years ago or something. So it's funny, now into the tens of thousands for these works. So it's kind of fascinating how the art market will elevate things. But Jordan Castile, a great painter, an emerging artist in America. Another great painter, Jennifer Packer. Another great painter, Jonathan Lyndon Chase. And I'll end things with a work by Eureka James. Eureka James is part of BOW, the Black Artists Union in Toronto. It's a group of black artists that formed as students at OCAD. They didn't really see a lot of what they were into in their classes and decided to have this kind of study group, support group, working group, and they do a lot of self-promoted shows. This work was actually on the cover of Canadian Art magazine last year, this painting, and I acquired the work through getting to know the artists in the collective and kind of gaining their trust, doing lots of studio visits. It's, not the kind of thing that, as a collector, I don't really go after artists. It's a kind of for the 15th time in the talk, I'm gonna say it's an organic process. It's having common interests, seeing people at art openings. Hey, someone told me you're a collector, you should see my work. I'm busy right now, can we, you come around to it 6 months later, you go and do a studio visit and you get blown away. And then, you see the work and you realize how it speaks to your own collection, other works in your collection. And, you know, I'm proud to say I'm one of the bigger collectors of African Canadian artists, and I think that that's, well, they're having a moment, and I'm hoping that this moment is a moment that will last and not just another kind of art world kind of fantasy where things kind of come and go. I'm looking at the long game when I think about the black artists in my collection. I want them to become part of the firmament and part of the story of contemporary art rather than a kind of a moment. Yeah, I remember back around, you know, 2010, 2020 when, like, you know, all those black artists had that moment. I do not want to be saying that in 20 years from now. You know, I want this to be, I'd rather it be a slow kind of process rather than all these things go way up in price and it just sort of, everyone moves on to the next thing, you know? That's my worry, and I think worry of a lot of people like Pamela and other curators. We have to make this something that lasts. So the last slide is just sort of how I live with art. I live in a different loft now, in downtown Toronto. It's around Roncesvalles area. I live in a loft with my wife and 2 boys, and we live with art. You can see the Barclay painting that's on tour now. That's a painting from Elizabeth McIntosh in the middle. A salt and pepper shaker collection, because collectors just collect things. And some photography in a hallway at home, a kitchen with art, and a hallway. So, you know, there's many ways to live with art. I'm the kind of collector that wants to see and experience the pieces, have them in my life, share them with other people. So I kind of hate to put things in storage. It's a big enough collection that I have to have a storage site, but it's moving things in and out, changing the art in my dental clinic. And you know, I think I'll end there, and I just wanted to say thank you for your attention. And if you have any other questions, we can entertain some now, but you also can visit the Wedge Collection online and see our long history of exhibitions with Wedge Curatorial Projects. Just Google Wedge Kenneth Montague. It'll go to wedgecuratorialprojects.org. And thank you, Pamela. Yeah.
Thank you.